Okay, thank you all very much. We will continue with the day's program. My name is Zoe Gray. I'm the moderator of this session, and I'm delighted to introduce to you, in the order that they are sitting, beginning on the far end, Defne Ayas, who is director of Witte de Wit Center for Contemporary Art in Rotterdam. Nikolaus Hirsch, who's an architect based in Frankfurt am Main. Fulya Erdemci, excellent, who was the curator of the last Istanbul Biennale and is an independent curator. And Bart, sitting next to me, who is director of MUCA in Antwerp. They have very long biographies. They've all done very many things. They're all busy with very many things, but you can read them in the program. We will touch upon some of them. Everyone is going to say a few words to begin with, and then we will open up for discussion. We are impressed by the ambitions of the conference organizers, who have given us some pretty large topics to discuss in the space of 1 hour. We have art, politics, and society. We are going to say the definitive word about all of these things, or not. We decided that it would perhaps be more fruitful as a starting point to pick some concrete examples of particular projects, particular curatorial projects that my four panelists are busy with or have recent experience of, as a way to discuss the intersection between these enormous terms of art, politics, and society. I think I might ask Nikolaus if he would begin, if that's all right with you.
Sure.
So I give the word to Nikolaus Hirsch.
Which is probably a very strange person to start with, since my background is originally architecture, which might introduce an important problem within the frame of our discussion, which is complicity. Architecture usually starts with a commission or a brief, which somehow assumes that you are already put into a situation of complicity with politicians or with society at large. And my own project actually started with, or the first project was, as a commission for, as an architect, was a monument in relation to the history of the Third Reich. And of course this was an enormous political exposure to deal with. And yeah, over the years, a number of projects were added and my work, and some of them clearly more in a curatorial role. One that could be mentioned was a project in New Delhi called Samohalan, a project that happened in a very poor area, what many people call slum. There might be other words to describe these settlements. But it was clearly a situation where there was from the outside, certainly also from the organizations that funded the project, there was an assumption that we would make transparent all the misery and almost in a kind of documentary way to take a position within the political and social drama that was going on there. Yet what we learned in the conversation with the mainly young people we worked with was actually that it was more about protecting this zone in a way of work, and to not make things transparent and not to overdo the political side, because it was already there. So why exposing and repeating it once more? Because there was a clear danger that by the end of the day we would just basically repeat the initial assumption and put somehow the participants of that project in a kind of frame, in a cage, which is called social misery. And so in that sense, this was for me an important lesson where I had to take a position in a complicit situation where I was already, by accepting the commission or the job, there was always already something like a compromise. And maybe on the other hand, there is always, without going too much into details of other projects, like a project I just did and continue doing in Korea, Real DMZ. There's always certainly also an option as an organizer of an art project or cultural project, there's always a possibility to withdraw, which is something that might not be in our minds very often, because we tend, and I'm not an exception here, we tend very often to say, the first instinct is to say yes, but I think there is the option no, very, very clearly, and it's something I had to learn also, to say no and to take a position in particular situations. So I'm in a way certainly taking the political and social dimension very seriously, but I also see the danger of faking agency, doing something or pretending something that is usually outside of the frame in which I'm working, and so therefore I think one has to look very carefully into these frames and to the logistics of an art project, and I think there are possibilities to withdraw, to possibilities for agency, but they have to be very particularly orchestrated. And maybe one should, in these cases, also step out of this from these initial assumptions and from the frame in which you started. And I'll keep it for the sake of discussion.
I think that leads us to the idea of withdrawal leads us perhaps to the example you wanted to give, Fulya, of a project where there was a very conscious and in some ways very debated decision to withdraw as an organizational strategy and perhaps as an ethical choice.
Curatorial choice.
As a curatorial choice, yeah.
Yes. I don't know how many of you had possibility to see the last 13th Istanbul Biennial, but I want to focus on it as it was coincided with one of the most exciting and maybe most unique civic awakening in Istanbul, the Gezi resistance. They overlap not only in terms of time, but also the main concerns, conceptual concerns of both were based on the public domain and also the transformation of the city. We were asking in our conceptual framework that can we take city as the spatial component of democratic apparatus. So Gezi resistance exploded through Gezi Park, which was planned to convert it into a shopping center, shopping mall. And all the questions, theoretical questions that I ask, if multiple publics, even the contrasting worlds, can come together, act together and live collectively, it realized, it came into the realm of reality, these conceptual questions, during a Gezi period, very short time. And as the praxis side of these theoretical questions, I concentrated on the city of Istanbul, the most contested areas like Gezi Park, like Taksim Square or Karaköy, and we had maybe more than 20 projects in the urban public spaces to realize before the Gezi resistance. But after Gezi had happened, actually we begin to question what does it mean to realize these projects. drawing on the ideas of Belgian philosopher Chantal Mouffe. For me, also the raison d'être of any art project realized in the public domain is to open up the conflict, even add more conflict, to make it visible and debatable. So with Gezi resistance, the conflict in the public domain, Gezi Park, Taksim Square, they all split open. And before the Gezi resistance, we were negotiating with the city authorities to get the permissions. And for instance, they didn't want to give permission for Gezi Park or Taksim Square. But after Gezi has happened, and during the Gezi, all the city authorities behaved really agoraphobically, and they repressed the society, they repressed the people on the street. For instance, they cut off the electricity in Gezi Park in order to evacuate the park, or they cut off the transport totally, people walk through the bridge and so forth. So after Gezi, they were really seeking desperately some promotion, some publicity. And if we realize these projects in the public spaces, we had to collaborate with the public authorities, and by this way we may instrumentalize the art project for the publicity of the authorities first. Secondly, not only that, it's also the public space. I'm telling you public space, but it was full of police and gas. So the public space is not free as such. But more than that, if we realize projects in the urban public domain, then instead of opening up the conflict to debate, we were to cover the conflict. So we open up a discussion in neighborhood parks. After Gezi, people begin to gather in the neighborhood parks. In 2 forums, we invited artists, activists, whoever interested in it, to open this question. Should we withdraw or should we realize these projects? Of course, some people said, you have to realize this, you have to reclaim the public domain, especially now, and with some kind of guerrilla type of art projects. Of course, it's a bit naive because biennales usually realize in 2 years the projects, the site-specific and so forth. But more than that, I have a small, I have a question about the relation of art and activism, guerrilla type of projects. Because yes, I believe that art and activism can learn from each other, can be in exchange, but they are not exactly the same thing. They cannot be measured with the same criteria, neither with the same impact. But more than that, the guerrilla type of projects, guerrilla type of activities are per se, by nature, is against all those institutional frames. And when you realize such projects in the institutional frames, then you domesticate them, then you reduce their impact. So I didn't want to realize such kind of things. So we withdraw just almost 1.5 months before the exhibition opens. Of course, it causes many practical, conceptual, and relational problems, but finally, with the collaboration of other institutions in Istanbul, we solved it. And of course, before the Gezi resistance, I wanted the exhibition to be free of charge, because we are talking about public domain, publicness, and I want the exhibition is accessible to everyone. But of course, Biennale has budgets, and Istanbul Biennial specifically has a very limited budget, so we could only afford 1 day before the Gezi. But when we decided to withdraw from the urban public spaces, I said it's a must. We have to make it free of charge. And finally, with the support of people, it became free of charge, and it was the most visited exhibition in Turkey. In 5 weeks, 340 people visited. Anyway, so I just wanted to very fast talk about the idea of withdrawal is also a kind of political gesture in certain situations, certain conditions. Of course, I would like to talk more about the sponsor of the Biennale, but maybe first I should give the word to the other speakers and then we continue.
Yeah, I think we should come back to that because there's an interesting question about the space of the institution, whether it's a museum or whether it's a Biennale, and its engagement in public space and in public debate, or a question of engagement or withdrawal, which I think brings us to the two examples that you wanted to bring up, Bart.
Okay, get the orange mic. I think institutions may be, in a certain way, kind of a good topos to discuss the problematics of the curatorial. They clarify things in a certain way, and we have the luck to have the kind of basics question of the space which curators negotiate, which is the space between art and society. And if so, if you have to put politics into that as part of that kind of in-between space. There was like two projects which came to my mind as opposite examples of for a question of which I do not have a solution, because I have not an ethical solution. I have rather a problem I can't resolve. One was 8 years ago. At that moment in Antwerp there was a danger, there was a radical right party, and the worst in Europe I think, that was in danger of getting an absolute majority in the city elections. If they would have got that, the whole of the country would have been fucked up. No, the whole discussion would have been around it. So it was clear that this was a moment to act as hard as we could. And there was an amazing activity from the culture field, from the art field. The main thing was a very famous rock group, Deus, that had not been performed in their home city of Antwerp for a long time. They set up concerts in which like 200,000 people attended, 2 television stations streamed it live against racism. And it changed the whole atmosphere of the city. It was fantastic. So at such a moment, it was on the open space close to the museum, so we became the press center of that, which was a minor thing. And then, some days after, I was discussing with Luc Tuymans, artist who is Antwerp-based, about the weakness of the visual art sector in relation to that. Basically, Luc was saying, it's about a kind of who controls the streets in a certain way. It's about a kind of presence, because what the radical right is doing, they pretend they're going to win. You know, they just take a stand and they say we're going to win, so we have to break that. And the concerts have been fine, but it's not enough. We just have to continue to make them clear that they're going to lose. At the same time, I must say, I had made contacts here in Vienna, so that if they would win, we could immediately ask some people from Vienna to come to discuss with the artists. But so, and he said that it should be like a fire alarm, not like the kind of, there had been an exhibition against racism in a gallery by the visual art sector, no. And they said, okay, let's do that. And we configured a kind of collective artwork, which Luc Tuymans was the initiator, in which the artists invited all the public institutions in the whole country to have a fire alarm go off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Thursday before the elections. And so we did, and it worked. Because it was primetime television news, it was on the front pages of so it was just a kind of action. And I'm happy to say that after that, this party self-destructed. So it's irrelevant now. So that's one example. So it may be important that in this kind of double question you have of the kind of the space of art which you are responsible for, and the space of society, that you have to say, now I have to choose, not for my responsibility, but for this kind of imminent responsibility. The radical right is an enemy, It's not only a kind of a counterpart, it's an enemy. If you can battle against the enemy, you just have to try to destroy them. But then you have to be effective. No? That's one side. One example. The counter-example for me is an exhibition we are making, which Anders Kruger, my Swedish-Lithuanian colleague, is making this summer in Muka, about the welfare state. Very strangely enough, in continental Europe, all the political parties, even the radical right, they implicitly use the welfare state as the base for their arguments. We need to spend more state money to save the welfare state, or we need to spend less money to save the welfare state, or we need to have foreigners out to save the welfare state. But the welfare state itself has theoretically not been thought anymore since the late 80s. There's a lot of literature until the late 80s, and then people forget to think about it. Now what Anders devised, we will not resolve the question, the image of the welfare state. We basically invite 8 artists that have been problematizing it. Because the welfare state, it's not utopia. It's very problematic, and especially to art. And within that we asked the 4 huge cultural archives in the country to offer us imagery about it. And the cultural archives, they are divided along ideological lines. So you have a socialist one, a Christian Democrat one, a liberal one, and a Flemish nationalist one. They're huge. Now they decided to work together. So they gave us together, for the first time they worked together, they gave us a survey of posters on the welfare state. One of these posters is a radical right poster, which I think is fantastic. It's fantastic that these scientists offer us this kind of challenge. Why is it fantastic? Because in a certain way the question I cannot resolve ethically in the relation between arts, politics and society is why we as an institution, what we are responsible for. In a certain way I think, if you speak not about the function of art but about its capacity, and you don't even go that far as saying the space needs to be agonistic. Obviously it will be, but in a certain way, if art can work, it should have some kind of publicness. And then it seems to me as a matter of principle that the more constituencies you are open to, and there we touch upon the discussion which Lolita and Tom had yesterday, you know, if you can also be open for your counterparts or for those people you don't immediately identify with, in some matter, as a matter of principle, it should be better. And my problem is that I don't know whether this matter of principle, how it can work, and I don't really know how to relate it with kind of partisan actions. So what's the kind of relation between being willing and then having to sometimes to go into the register which you are using? You know, the kind of covering up even, or taking care, completely unspectacular. Perhaps, I don't know whether, so my ethics can prove itself to be ethical.
Thank you, Bart. Defne.
Go somewhere.
Somewhere. Where do I go?
I mean, something that comes up very strongly from what you're saying, Bart, is about this, perhaps a difference between art and, by extension, curatorial responsibility and capacity.
I think I can speak more from an institutional ethics, maybe more than the curatorial ethics, and that distinction we can also talk about. But I'm trained as a political scientist, and now I'm the director of Wit, which is a presentation institute in the Netherlands that was set up to invent and to lead the way for institutions like museums. So its purpose was constantly be on your feet and generate for 25 years now. And I always think, I also came back from this background of, before the art world, at the cross-section of talent management, VC, fundraising for the Democrats, as a Turk in New York. And arriving, and the question is always like, how much do you need to know to perform? with an institutional capacity, but also as a curator, how much do you have to know about the history of hip-hop and punk, but also about China, but also Athens. And when you start thinking about the European avant-garde, let's say the first futurist, Marinetti, being born in Egypt, and having fought at the border of Greece and Turkey during the Balkan War as a war journalist, and being so affected by the sounds of war that he started thinking a lot about how he should explode the layouts of books and graphic design. Or the first futurist woman poet, Valentine Saint-Juan, who wrote about lust, the manifesto of lust, how she fought against the colonial forces in Syria, but moved to Egypt to convert to Islam. So you sort of start thinking also politics, how it shaped European avant-garde, and why we should keep thinking about the, let's say, Middle East. Or what's the role of Germany in instigating Islamic fundamentalism, and why is it claiming so much Ai Weiwei, when Ai Weiwei is not even known in his own homeland, but maybe so his father, who's a poet and a minister of culture formerly. So those relations are really important to keep in mind, so the socio-political context within which cultural systems are shaped. So when I arrived to Netherlands, which Zoe knows very well, and Bart was on our board, and Fulya was in Holland, so I don't know what your background would be in Dutch ecology, of course with Nikolaus being my predecessor. It was this landscape also of the artist being a bit the parasite. So it wasn't the Turk and the Moroccan, the other, but it was also the othering of the artist that was really in the air, and this confidence in the idea of EU, European Union, was teetering, like shaky. So I thought, okay, Rotterdam, let's set up this online platform because you wanted the example. And it's also this pressure on humanities is in place. So how can we learn from ancient cities that can help with the reshaping of the ideas around the formation of EU? So Athens was a desk, Jerusalem was a desk, Alexandria, now Cairo, is a desk. You know, let's look at these histories. What happens with economy in Athens when it's set to zero? What happens to Jerusalem, the religious negotiations that take place in one building in 3 shifts? What happens in, what did I say? Alexandria now, of course, Cairo, and with knowledge production. But 1,000 years, not only focus on the now, but also think of a bit of the broader spectrum, not only be stuck in 20th century paradigm, but think of the broader, also with Istanbul, or with all the places. DMZ, I guess, would be relevant too, but so the Athens desk, we worked with an economist for 2 years. He was the most professional writer we've had. We are always submitting in time, unlike the art world where you have to constantly chase. He was the most astute writer we had, and we lost him because he became the Minister of Finance in Greece, the most mediated man right now, as you know, Yanis Varoufakis. And it was the most prolific, I think, partnership we had. So the relationship between art, politics, the institution. The other, you know, also, of course, there are other aspects of this thing, but what should I tell you? Another example? Or one more example? Maybe I do one more example, because ethics is also like how much you can do. Also within art world, because there are certain risks you must take to the risk of losing some of your immediate audiences, which is also the rarefied contemporary art world. You know, they look at you with awe when you do certain things that are maybe not art or art world friendly. So the project I rather proudly co-commissioned as Witte de Wit was a project by Paula Peavy, and she's a market darling and a certain aesthetics that I wouldn't necessarily go for, but the project she was undertaking was an archive, and in that sense it's really important how an institution can be tooled to support the vision of an artist, whether it's a project or an archive or giant idea that they want to have this transformative effect on culture. And she was collecting portraiture and photographic information on all the reincarnated masters of Tibet, as they are spread everywhere, right? Mongolia, Nepal, India, America, England, Thailand. And this type of a database has never existed for the Tulkus, who are the reincarnated masters. So one being Dalai Lama, another being Karmapa, who's kidnapped in China, another one being Panchen Lama, different schools. And about 2,000 images she collected through 60 lenders. But what was interesting is that the institution became also part of this ongoing archive where audiences would bring their own pictures, all the Polder Buddhists, everybody who believed in Tibetan Buddhism from the 70s onwards, to the point that every photographic image is considered sacred. So all of a sudden, an institution that is so invested in a visual aesthetic discourse that is neutral became actually almost a religious site where people came to pray, and we were not allowed to use any image, even though the whole exhibition looked like a Google search engine, like image search engine. We were not allowed to point to images, we were not allowed to use images to promote this image index. And 60 lenders, all 20th century, a bit of history of photography, of course, as a result, how the Western eye entered Tibet. But also for a culture that has always thought about imaging and image, for a culture that made connections between religion and neuroscience and art history. So you dig also the stories of Dalai Lama with boys and, you know, general idea with the black school and so forth. So you map the art historical links that have been forgotten, but then you make this archive that then gets to be donated in 8 years of its making to Tibet, with a constellation of Tibetan scholars. So it's not only the Western gaze that actually perpetuate. So Viterevet actually for 2 floors were covered with this archive, and people constantly kept giving images of Tulkus. So believers came. It was unbelievable. So yeah, that's another example.
At the beginning of your intervention, you made a distinction between curatorial and institutional ethics. Is that a distinction that any of the other of you would subscribe to or think exists?
As I said in the beginning, I think there is, in the problematics of institutional ethics, I think, clarify what for me is a basic question which I think all curatorial ethics should also apply. If you are given a space, what's your relation to that space? You know, do you use it and exhaust it? You know, you do a biennale and there's not a biennale afterwards. Case of one of the colleagues I esteem most highly. Or do you take a risk? Do you take into account its continuation? You know, what's the kind of, I think that's always in a certain way, and it's a very problematic for me, a relation which is hard to resolve, in which, for example, I really do agree, I mean, abstaining or withdrawing, it's continuously a kind of a relevant question. Because it's something, in a certain way, which you always need to have in the back of your mind. Am I still doing something that is meaningful to this kind of abstract space, but also to the concrete space?
Maybe to extend on this, you know, as much as I guess most of us are very careful, or try to be very careful and conscious about our work within institutions or as a curatorial practice. I think the reference, or the instrumental reference to politics is, I think it's incredibly difficult, and it's not a one-liner. You start with a political idea and then you make an exhibition, or you think you are an agent. And maybe to give an example in which is not the art field again, but the Triennale in 1968, curated by, or I think the word curator didn't exist then, but directed by Giancarlo De Carlo. No, it was 68, was of course a very crucial year, a political year. And De Carlo, he was really trying to challenge the whole idea of what an exhibition is, what the relation between this medium of architecture, but you could replace it by art, what that relation to society and politics is by really following an idea of participation. The show was called The Big Number, Il Grande Numero. And what happened was that, well, the number, ironically speaking, became too big. The whole show was, on the day of the opening, was basically occupied by students from diverse Milanese universities, and the show had to be shut down on the next day. Which is not really, it's not a withdrawal, but there was a moment where I think a director was very conscious about the political situation and maybe didn't really sense what might happen. But I think this became a very crucial moment for an exhibition. So he tried very hard to be exposed within this political challenge, but it ended in a big sit-in with many discussions, new working groups popping up. So it is now, in historical reading, considered as the most productive architectural exhibition ever. By default.
For Fulya. Because, I mean, what's so precious about this gathering is also this peer-to-peer moment where we can share experiences. And in your experience in Istanbul, and obviously you thought about your every step, and it sounds like you've considered every option and you came to that conclusion. But if you look back now, would you have done it differently? Because it's easy to, you know, also retrospectively constantly validate what you've done, and I'm convinced about your argument. But on the other side, there was this transformative potential that was really sort of streaming in the city and the protests. Like, and at those junctures where we hit that spot, cul-de-sac, you know, you're convinced that that's the right decision, and it was the right decision. But if you think now, would you have done, I should have maybe done that? Have you had that moment of?
Actually, in every exhibition, after some time, when I look back, I change almost everything. So this is not specific to Istanbul Biennial, but in Istanbul Biennial also, it's not only my situation is not at the stake, but how come you can go to a protest? You can be in the custody. This is your personal decision. But Istanbul Biennial, 88 artists participated all around the world, from especially the south and the east. How come I can ask artists who doesn't know exactly the context to make a guerrilla type of projects in public space, risking their life, because 10 people died during and after the Gezi resistance, and they can be put into jail. Many people, hundreds of people, thousands of people in jail. So it's also, I don't find myself in the position to ask, especially all the international artists. And for me also, sincerely speaking, the function of art in public domain is to open up the conflict. And if you do, with the permission of the authorities, art projects in public domain, then you kind of soften their position and give them a prestige that they lost very badly. So I think I wouldn't do that. And of course, I would like to do exhibitions in public domain, and now I am doing one in Cappadocia.
I think from looking backwards, let's look forwards, because two of you on this panel have been appointed kind of independently but in parallel to work together on the Moscow Biennale. If we're talking about a complicated context, if we're talking about complicity, if we're talking about negotiation, I think Moscow is a very charged site for these topics, this ethical wrangling that you will no doubt face. How are you preparing yourself for this project?
I can't answer, I don't have my cue what to do.
Well, before I go to Moscow, I actually have the challenge of doing the Turkish pavilion in Venice in the year anniversary of the genocide. And it's the Turkey that you left during the Istanbul Biennial that the project somehow will be shouldering with the Turkey in mind, that with an Armenian artist who's also confronting the anniversary of 1915. But okay, that's another discussion. Moscow is an invitation that I received actually from Bart Baere, who was appointed to be the chief curator of the Moscow Biennial by Joseph Bachstein, who's also here. And I think it would be very good to test it together here also with this precious audience. What's the situation in Moscow? It's a completely new terrain for me. I worked in many parts of the world, but not in China. But obviously everything that I looked as material defaults back to Russia, one way or the other. Whether you want to do futurism, you want to do Maoism, you want to do conceptualism, it defaults back to Russia, and it's in the way it's the only critical space that is rather left, the Moscow Biennial, that is on the verge of also disappearing, or not, maybe. It's this battle between existence and non-existence, and it's that fine line, and Russia is where everything is more blatantly transparent. And maybe it's more foiled and hidden in different parts of the world, but it's much more open in that sense. And then our co-curator is also Nikolaus Schaffhausen, so maybe it's something we can open up also today.
Yeah, to be clear, there's no, and we started to work together on the sixth version of the second version of the Moscow Biennial. Now we are doing together the third. There's no chief curator, there's just 3 people who work together. And I think what may be an important question to start with is like your basic question, like, do you or don't you? In which I think there's 2 opposite images. One is Kiev, where apparently there was a decision not to do the biennial because of the war. The other for me is Kosovo, and the importance which art had as a kind of presence in this horrible siege of the city. And Bosnia-Herzegovina, right? So it is a kind of, if you have a situation which is volatile, and if you're a professional, you should abstain, because you take a risk which is unbearable. But at the same time, a situation like that may crash, but it may offer opportunities. And in a certain way, if you look at the world at large, also the world from a position of Vienna, I mean, I really do hope we don't get into another blockade with the other part of Europe for the next 10 or 15 years. You know? There's really, in a certain way, kind of any future for that side of Europe, or for this side of Europe, or for Turkey, because even if Turkey, you know, it's a solution in which there is in some way a kind of understanding. So it seems that it may be interesting to take the risk to go there together. And what we basically will do, in a most amazing, I think, place, as good as Arena Secession, or even better, in the pavilion number 1 of VDNKH, the huge, in a certain way, the heart of the symbol of the Soviet, the dream of the Soviet Union, is a very short biennial. A biennial of 10 days, in which we have to scrap several things, because if your budget is small to start with, and then the ruble drops to half of its value to continue, you have to take decisions. So we scrapped the catalog, and we scrapped basically all the things that made the contemporary professional art world so expensive. I mean, transports you simply cannot allow for. So you understand that you have to take some decisions. And then you end up with something that might become interesting, which is that you decide to engage with people. That's what we did, basically. When the second project proved impossible and we went for the third project and we succeeded in getting hold of the central pavilion of VDK, a decision to say, because in a certain way the urgent problem there and here, and I think it's a very beautiful understanding of Defne, Moscow is not the other thing.
No.
Moscow is here. You know, what's happening in Moscow is what's happening here. And so, you know, it's just more, there's a clarity perhaps there which is larger, but you can very well, I think, compare the substances. And perhaps the most urgent question is how to live together.
Can I add something?
Please.
Not from,
I love to give you the microphone.
it's not from marketing of our 6 Moscow Biennial, but you know, there are so many prejudices around. Most of the Europeans, as if we talk about Europe, have never, as of the art system, yeah, of our systems, have never ever been to Moscow.
It's our most fantastic city.
And this is really, yeah, emotionally also lost. So, and I got a very interesting, from Amalia Ullmann, by the way, a very young artist, 25 years old, when we invited her. And she said, you know, my mother, and this is why she accepted, she thinks this is the heart of Europe. And without Moscow in our all hearts, as Europeans or based in Europe, we are lost, you know. This is, it's also interesting, we are, the 3 of us, one German, Belgium, Turkish.
Sorry, you are Austro-Hungarian. I mean, at least that's a lot more you.
No, but we have also nothing to lose, no? So it's, we are not Russian. We cannot get in, let's say, prison or, it's so interesting. It's so interesting to just to think about it, yeah? And we are not on the safe side, and we don't know exactly what you said. We don't know what will happen, if it will function or not. This is.
Yeah, but talk about function. I guess one cannot reduce the meaning of that Biennale to a function as the kind of free space for critique, etc. I think that, to my extent, would really become a burden also for you as curators, almost, to argue that way, because I think it's a bit too much. Yeah? Because if you look at the global scale, I'm throwing money or someone. Talk about money. Yeah, well, if you look on a global scale, you will find out, according to UN statistics, that there have never been more wars than today, more political conflicts. So I guess the global art world would immediately shrink, so that you cannot work anywhere. And I think in that sense, I totally agree that it's here, and which so the decisions or the discussions are here wherever you are. And this would probably also downplay a little bit the question, because in the end of the day, the artwork will not exemplify the political problem. I guess this is what you want to avoid, that the artists become examples of something, or the artwork would become an instrument. I think this would be, I think, something that Olaf Nikolaus, sorry.
And I think that one of the dangers, because in a certain way the situation we have been led into, I think starting from the mid-80s, was that you are just completely drawn into an immediacy, into only this moment. Yeah? And so there's problems in this, only this moment, and you have to react immediately to these problems, only this moment. Yeah. And on the other hand, you may have a kind of evacuation. You may have different ways to evacuate. One of the clear ones is to go to a kind of a future. But then you get away also from a kind of urgency. And what we are basically trying to do is to be here and now, but hoping, I mean, in such a way that it might bring something to a future.
So would you argue that in this triangle between art, politics and society, want to use urgency as a tool, almost like creating or understanding the exhibition as a state of exception? Something
A state of exception is
overdone.
Perhaps an event in the good sense of the word. You know, an event in the full sense of the word. Something which has an intensity, and I think especially biennials, but then we go from curatorial and institutional to biennial ethics. I think the capacity of a biennial is precisely that. You know, it's to be a heterotopia. It's a whole series of good words already. To be a kind of a space in which things happen you don't know yet. I've come to give you the microphone. You don't want to?
I was kind of astonished what you said. Nobody says anything against it, obviously, that Moscow is somehow here. This is Moscow, only another version. I cannot relate to that. The other thing is, when the manifesto went to St. Petersburg last year, there had been lots of artists protesting against this move, because not only, they said, the urge came because of the Ukrainian war or the beginning war or Crimea conflict, but also because the manifesto would prove something that is wrong, and it would prove, and this is why the Biennale was so wanted in St. Petersburg, to prove that contemporary arts, like in its most radical and extreme form and out on the street, is possible in Russia these days. And lots of artists said this is not true, and what you are doing there, then Kaspar Koenig, is kind of building up a facade. So I'm wondering, like, hearing from what is going on in Russia and under which circumstances artists work in Russia, especially in Moscow, I wonder if you could relate to the fact that the Biennale itself is not just about organizing it, doing kind of a specific program, stripping it down maybe because of the difficulties, but that authorities do like to have biennales because it somehow insists on the fact that it is possible to have a proper biennale in a city, and that it says there is some kind of democratic openness, publicity, and all of that. And if you don't think that's kind of a problem, because even before you start your work, you are making a statement, which is, yes, it will be possible. And one had seen at the manifesto that very many things had not been possible, and that step by step the curators had to accept these facts. Until the very last moment, when all the rental money that was paid from the manifesto to a small venue that they used, in the end, was all taken by the landlord and sent to the Russians fighting in the Ukraine, saying this is what happens when you come to Russia and do biennales, maybe in the best mood.
One of the many differences between here and Moscow, because of course there's a huge amount of differences. I think the way in which, and Defne can say it perhaps in a more precise way, that it is possible to see there a lot of things which are relevant here also. Of course it's different. Here people are speaking German, there people are speaking Russian. There's hundreds of differences. One of them is that the authorities there actually do not like this way of using a contemporary art biennial to prove that they are open. Basically, they don't give a shit. So this kind of negotiation, which you might, if that would be the case, you could have a different negotiation. It's basically, I think, to my understanding, has been on the verge of not happening. And then you should ask yourself, is it more interesting it will not happen, so we have proof of what we know, that this is not an open society, or is it more interesting that it happens and it allows for a certain space to continue? I cannot really, so that's there is in any case a major difference. The politics there does not function in the way cultural politics functions here, in which indeed politicians want the biennial to prove that the situation is open and future-oriented.
Can I ask you, Fulya, because you had the experience of being part of the curatorial team for the previous Biennale, and perhaps the situation, the wider political situation in Russia was less visible to the outside world than it is today, but what was your experience of these negotiations that Bart is discussing? Did you find there is a political will to use the Biennale as a tool of promotion, or has that never been the case then?
Actually, at that time, the political conflict was not this open. In 2007, I guess, I was one of the curators. But I want to go back to Istanbul Biennial because a similar situation happened in Istanbul Biennial. There were protests against the sponsor of the Istanbul Biennial because they are involved with military vehicles, production of military vehicles. And actually I learned it during the first press conference we made for Istanbul Biennial from the activists that and someone asked me at that time, if you knew this before, would you have accepted to be the curator of Istanbul Biennial? At that time I said, definitely yes. Because either you have a platform, incubation place to bring out all these topics through the exhibition into public security consideration, public debate, or you just leave and don't talk about it. Art, unlike other fields, art really happens historically also in the middle of systems, economies, and it realizes itself through these systems. But unlike other fields, it has the power to unfold it critically through the artworks. For instance, when I heard about this sponsorship situation, I felt obliged to share this information with the artists because they don't know too. And for instance, Hito's title responded it with a very, very strong critical work. She has been working on art institutions' relation with power, and she also bring out Koch specifically in her work, and there were other works also related to that. So for me, the art doesn't happen in a peaceful places. It can happen in the middle of the conflict, and it can open up and it can speak about that. So I hope you have that possibility in Moscow, and yes, support the people who wants to talk.
I also would like to give the microphone to Joseph Backstein, who's the founding director of the Moscow Biennial. Where you stand, I think that would be very...
What do you want me to talk about?
Huh? Moscow.
I think.
Do you think Moscow is in Vienna? That was the question.
I think it's not been very important project for the Moscow art scene. It's been started 10 years ago and been organized before all the major art institutions been set up, like Garage or Vinzavod and other private institutions as well, and the state institution as well. That's why we're doing, I think, interesting job, and together I think we're going in the right direction. And I totally agree with Bart, who explained you our purposes and goals and values in this project. I think it will go going well, and it will be accepted both by the authorities and by the society. I want to say.
Yeah, can we, because one of our panelists has to leave soon, so we will open up to some questions.
One small question.
No, of course.
I think it was a very interesting mention that Joseph just made, that it's going to be a very important event for the Moscow art scene. Yeah. I wonder, as curators of the Moscow Art Biennial, who do you think is going to be your audience? Whom are you going to work for? And in relation to that, I will come back to the story I was telling people yesterday as well, that in Lithuania we see on cable a lot of Russian TV, and people do watch it, and it's propaganda in all capital letters. So I watched TV journalist speak with the film director Zvagintsev on his film Leviathan, who was awarded prizes, and was pushing him into the corner, and he was agreeing and confirming that the film has nothing to do with contemporary Russian realities, has only general human values behind that. So you imagine what the art scene actually is living through also in Moscow. So who is going to be that target audience that you are, working with? Do not imply any criticism. I'm just interested in how you articulate that. And a small question also, how many Russian artists do you think you are going to invite?
Indeed, we are getting into a completely, in a danger of a completely antagonistic situation. As I said before, I think that would be horribly sad for all of us. If we would get into that completely antagonized situation, and indeed, Russian television propaganda is of a level and a kind of brutality that's astonishing. Who our audience? We in a certain way we don't know. There's some indications. One indication is that for the Moscow art scene, whatever it means, whether it should be allowed alive in the presence or not, whether it is allowed the presence or not, there's like 40 events around it. And I know of at least one which has more financial capacity than the biennial itself. So, in a certain way, I do think that in some way, which we cannot predict because we cannot predict what's going to happen, at least part of what you mentioned as the Moscow art scene is going to be an audience. Since you know probably Vedenkaha, which has been dilapidated for some time, it has been renovated in a huge way, so we do know that there is going to be a huge audience of people who perhaps are not only not aware of art, and I don't speak about contemporary art, but about art at large, and perhaps not even that interested in culture, but who do feel that this place is a place they want to go to. And actually, after these 10 days, there's going to be a documentary exhibition remaining, or at least that's planned, for another month and a half, which people can visit. So that's a second very probable audience. People who are not involved or even interested or aware of the existence of art, not only contemporary art. And a third audience might be, but we only have stupid words for that, but it might be for a coming audience, a coming constituency, some people we don't know. And in a certain way, the choice we have to make is for this kind of real relations happening at that moment.
I actually like that you mentioned this third potential category, an audience you don't know. Because I personally, I'm always a bit suspicious that we're always expected to know what the audience is, because it means also, it implies that we can construct it. It's a kind of social engineering, and of course this is happening with the smartest and biggest art institutions today. They're trying to do this, like Tate and MoMA, etc. Yeah? So they try to cover all aspects of society, all ages, all sexes, all nations, and so for me, because I'm having to leave now, it's a plea for not knowing the audience. I will withdraw now. But it's not a political gesture. I have to run to the airport.
Do we have time to continue, or do we...
No, you can continue, but I think he needs to get to the...
No, I know that, so that was the question. Are there more questions from the audience?
Maybe, Lolita, to your answer, can I also answer that? No, I think the question of instrumentalization. number one, that was the previous question, because you're really at that fragile, precarious line. It might happen, and you know it might happen, and you still build up your content that it might happen, instead of saying no and withdrawing, because that would collapse. And the same thing with the Turkish pavilion this year. I should say Pavilion of Turkey, because we finally learned to say Pavilion of Turkey and not Turkish pavilion. It is actually, the representation of a nation is actually funneled through a secularly, privately sponsored foundation that has opened up the space for art, music, theater, dance, biennial, so forth, for the last 30, 40 years in Istanbul. It's because of that space opened, and it might even be taken over, that function, and I'm only speculating because there's nothing in the air yet, by the religious government that actually wants to start putting its stamp on what culture, art, and architecture should look like, which is completely antithetical to the world of operation that we are all figuring out our ways in different capacities. So it is also a very tenuous situation. Yes, the year of the genocide, and it's the Turkish government, slightly, it's under the auspices of the government that it's operating, but by its nature, for the last years that it has existed, it actually has nothing to do with the government, except the government might still instrumentalize it and say, look, we supported an Armenian in this year, aren't we great? Instead of apologizing to all the Armenians we kicked out in 1915 and repatriate them. So you're always in that fine line. Will you be instrumentalized? Are they smart enough to try to do that? And what's your exit strategy there? Because you still have room to withdraw. I mean, it's not, there's still room. Yes, now we look like we're complicit and we're going forward because we want to see what is possible, but there's still always that option. And that goes to the question of Zoe, like ethics. Where do you unplug and unplug?
I mean, it also comes back to the topic we were discussing yesterday, that was kind of focusing in its context more on young emerging curators and the risk of being instrumentalized versus the ambition and the potential of being an instrument for change, an agent, a participant as a contributor to a wider discourse. I think we come back to several of the same questions because they are key. We have a question here from the audience.
I just wanted to point out that I think that ascribing any model to the Moscow Biennial, like anything in Turkey that's happening, is kind of problematic because Putin is such a master in soft power, and he seeks to control culture in a way that most political dictators, if you will, haven't done in recent years, I think. And I guess the question becomes, can we disassemble the master with the master's tools? And I think largely that's, kind of a negative outcome. And so further, a question is, to what extent is working in Russia an endorsement of Putin's control over culture and cultural politics?
I think that's kind of rejoining Katrin Lowe's question of earlier.
That's relevant questions. It comes down to, I will never forget the moment I was with this very beautiful organizer in the south of France. At the moment the Front National got in the department an absolute majority. And this is a person of Jewish origin. And I was driving with him and he said, it's not all of the people, it's a majority, but the Paris intellectuals were saying we should withdraw the money of the franc from it. So, and that's in a certain way because the question at that moment becomes relevant of withdrawal or continuation. And it's, that's what I said earlier, it's the opposite side of what I tried to open up in the beginning. It's a question, but I think it remains a question, and it remains possible to have a hypothesis. And actually, I've been the point of withdrawing after the first version of the biennial, in which everything was arranged, and at that moment the space was taken for reasons that are for me unclear, that were ascribed to Putin. Now I happened to have a possibility to inform, and from the President's office no question had been put. So the only thing I know is that the space, which was very close to the Kremlin, which would have been a different project and with a different kind of approach, that it suddenly disappeared by a decision somewhere between me and Putin. And we might be confronted with the same question. This cannot be predicted. But at the same time, to say, and that's what I say in this kind of the danger of antagonism becoming total is huge. You know, sometimes it may be good to being aware of the fact that you're not in a comfortable position, you're not in a clear position, you're not in a position where you can have trust. Still, it's better to speak than not to speak. Actually, next week, it's on a much smaller level. I will have, or 2 weeks from now, I have a meeting with some of my colleagues in my country. I mean, they really did a horrible try to chop some possibilities for the museum I'm working with, which I think is very stupid. Still, I'm going to speak with them.
Do we have any more questions?
Because it's clear for me, everybody on the desk is now working in Moscow or in Istanbul. Of course, it's very obviously that there are certain conflicts which are integrated in the building up of the system in which you are operating there. And then, of course, to have the decision to do it or to do it not is maybe then also the wrong question in the moment where you still see a chance for a certain kind of a performance. Which could place a level of critical approach to the daily situation in Moscow by a certain intelligence. And I trust you in this structure of intelligence. But we shouldn't be so naive when we're speaking, because what we are now circulating around is the question of can these things said or not, and in which form and under which strategy. But when we're looking in the old West Europe, and I very much agree when you said there is something in this conflict structure which appeared in Moscow or in Istanbul, which has an echo in Europe, in the old Europe. And this echo is very much on stage in the structure of censorship. It's on stage mostly not in the big capitals of the countries, because the stage is too visible. But the stage is sometimes in smaller villages. It's appear in the daily political negotiation field that we have here a lot of censorship. And even if a kind of a ridiculous magazine like Monopol is having 1.5 years ago a headline saying censorship is back in Europe, then we maybe also reflect very much in a situation, maybe in Moscow or here in this space, where we are political, to put this question on the table and project structures of censorship only on this one side. When we on the other side already know that there are certain companies who sponsoring a lot of projects in Germany, they have also a blacklist of artists. They are also connected with the military industry. And we don't discuss that, and we still have all institutional possibilities to avoid this, not to avoid it, to go for the conflict. And then the question is also very much why we don't do it.
And that, I think, answers the question of why Moscow is possibly Europe in Vienna or wherever else. Maybe I cannot judge the Vienna situation, but what you described is exactly, you have an extreme version, but is that a possible future or a reality?
I also want to tell that what you are talking about is not censorship from outside, but auto-censorship. And withdraw sometimes means engagement, but sometimes also censorship by ourselves.
Yeah, there's a very messy renegotiation taking part between what is possible and what is not. In some way, and really I didn't mean, the lady left, I hope she was not too angry, but I didn't mean it in an anecdotal sense, saying this city of Vienna is really very much like that city of Moscow, except that I think Vienna is one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, and so is Moscow. And I think we should cherish, we have like 10 of these cities, you know, basically, and we should cherish all of them. So I didn't mean it too anecdotally, but indeed I think, and that's something I learned from Defne in a conversation, is that, I mean, we can learn for here, you know, here I mean in Belgium, to be clear, not to, or Holland, but the whole Benelux, not necessarily Austria. And for certain we should not exoticize in a negative way, because that doesn't lead anywhere.
I'm being given wrapping it up signs, but there's one more question, and then we will have
it's
to.
not so much a question, it's more just a comment
One
about the relation between politics and ethics. Because what I really like is that, to me at least, it became quite clear that it is not a road that you just know what you want to do and you have to go for it. The politics is more a complicated constellation. When Defne was naming her contributor, Janis, to the Willy Witt, who is now part of the Greek government, who has no problem to be with Putin on the same table. So it would be maybe interesting to ask him to contribute to the non-existing catalog.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. An enormous thank you to my panelists. I think we could keep talking for a long time, but everyone is wilting with heat. There will be a break of 20 minutes. So if you can be back for 5 to 7
Thank you very much
for the final panel. Thank you very much.